True crime has become one of the fastest growing and highest grossing entertainment genres on multiple streaming platforms, amassing billions of views each year. With its continual success, a constant influx of content creators are capitalizing on this growing opportunity. As crime continues, true crime entertainment will follow, and the genre only grows. But behind every case are real people watching their deepest traumas being turned into entertainment narratives. As we consume true crime content from the safety of our screens, we must ask ourselves, are the ethical considerations of true crime entertainment worth the potential harm it perpetuates? It's time to investigate the dark underbelly of this booming genre. Hey, welcome. You probably don't know me, and if you do, you're my professor, so hello. This video essay initially started out as a project for my fourth year seminar, but has developed into somewhat more of a passion project of mine. I really wanted to discuss the ethics of true crime entertainment, specifically the content from digital streaming platforms like YouTube, TikTok, Spotify, basically content that is developed by the public for the public. So, what is true crime? It's a non-fiction genre that involves real-life criminal cases. The ones that become truly popular are those including murders, robberies, and other violent crimes. At its core, it's the casual storytelling of violent, gory, traumatic, and what's even worse, real scenarios featuring real-life victims. For the purpose of this video, we'll define true crime as the privately produced content from digital content creators. And I'm not talking about the high-production companies, as I'm sure we're all aware of. This is because I really want to comment on our responsibilities as private individual producers and consumers of digital media. As someone who has consumed true crime as a form of entertainment in the past, I set out to address the ethical considerations and questions behind our interest in the genre. Why is it that we are so fascinated by true crime? Why are we so invested in other people's trauma? And why are we so interested in how a serial killer's mind works? Over the course of this video, I hope to make my argument clear that true crime should not be treated as a casual form of passive entertainment, as it involves the real lived experiences of victims. Content creators should thus avoid trivializing and fictionalizing their case coverages. In doing so, true crime has the potential to motivate and foster supportive communities, as well as evolve the criminal justice system. Rather, such content should be delivered with sensitivity and in a way that inspires active participation and critical engagement. So, true crime is by no means a new genre, but has certainly been exacerbated by social media, as many other things are. Dating back as far as the 16th century, true crime initially developed due to the emergence of criminal justice, as well as the printing press. But because the print was so inaccessible, these writings were only offered to the upper echelons of society. So it didn't start out as a layman's pastime. They were quite gory in nature, but their morals emphasized that crime and sin would be punished inevitably, and they worked to warn against such behavior in the future. With the emergence of widespread literacy and print media in the 1800s, literature began to evolve more into a pastime than strictly an academic pursuit. This led to the establishment of true crime as a distinct genre within literature. True crime was then presented in the form of penny dreadfuls, which are cheap comics meant for the working class. So technology redefined true crime during the 20th and 21st centuries, during the information age. We saw it expand into documentaries, television shows, theater, novels, and now, with social media streaming platforms, videos and podcasts. With credits to the digital world, it has transformed from a rich man's hobby to one of the highest grossing genres in the digital realm. Now, anyone who has a camera and microphone and has access to the internet can produce virtually anything. Like me. As with many other digital platforms, we no longer need experience or schooling in entertainment to entertain. Whether that is to the detriment or benefit of the ever-evolving digital content world and the true crime genre, that's for us to discuss. The ethics of this genre requires a more nuanced conversation, one that I hope to bring to you today. Now, let's start off by looking at the popularity of true crime. According to YouGov, over half of Americans enjoy true crime, and I'm just going to focus on one study as I think it's one of the most comprehensive, though not completely indicative of Canadian consumers. Unfortunately, research about Canadian consumers of true crime isn't as widely available as for Americans, it's not unreasonable for us to assume that our numbers don't significantly vary either way. So let's get into this study. So as you can see, half of Americans say that they enjoy true crime, with 1/3 stating that they enjoy this content at least once a week. And I'm going to quote directly here. The most common real-life crimes Americans say have inspired content they've consumed are murder, 52%, serial killing, 45%, kidnapping, 37%, and organized crime, 35%. YouGov study also found that while women are only slightly more likely than men to consume content involving nonviolent crimes, including corruption, fraud, drug trafficking, and hacking, they are far more likely than men to say that they've consumed content on violent crimes, including murder, kidnapping, domestic abuse, and sexual assault. Very interesting. So, according to Triton Digital, true crime emerged as the overall top genre listened to by females aged 18+. Moreover, true crime secured the highest position for females aged 25 to 34, and those aged 45 to 54 as well. We'll talk about gender a little bit later, but for now, I want to talk a little bit about the current public response to true crime content. YouGov also published a poll asking participants whether they thought true crime content had a positive or a negative effect on society. 38% of all surveyed answered neither positive nor negative. More people leaned more to the negative opinion, 14% saying somewhat negative, 8% saying extremely negative, as opposed to 12% who said somewhat positive and 4% who said extremely positive. And I think it's kind of interesting and important to kind of understand how people are currently responding to true crime content. And so I'm going to put a screenshot by YouGov of their study on the next screen, and you can pause to read it. So the numbers are very clearly there. People are indeed watching true crime, and the numbers are stunningly high. I mean, half of Americans? Before critiquing anyone or anything, let's first get into the potential reasons as to where this fascination comes from. I think it's first very interesting and important to address the role of narration and storytelling in the true crime genre. True crime is evolving into becoming more and more sensationalized and appropriated to become more palatable to general viewers on the internet. And storytelling is highly responsible for this popularity. So, as an English and humanities major, storytelling has always been at the forefront of my own fascination. It's a centuries-old means of communication between history and the present to the future. According to Jonathan Gottschall in his book, The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human, the ability of storytelling sets Homo sapiens apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. So humans are fundamentally storytelling creatures. We look for stories and create stories in everything we do, including our jokes, anecdotes, gossip, fairy tales, novels, religion, film, media, legal proceedings, and true crime. There's a reason why true crime is so popular, and it mainly boils down to the way we are innately storytelling creatures. To put it plainly, narrative and storytelling is the unique way for humans to make sense of and feel a sense of mastery over a world of chaos and nonsense. Humans naturally like to decipher patterns and make sense of concepts that we cannot explain. Not to get too existential, but this is due to our innate tendency to try to make sense of our existence. And storytelling is a means to try and solve a bit of the puzzle that plague the human existence. So, storytelling is the human way of making sense of the chaotic world, and there is nothing more chaotic than violent crime. True crime entertainment thus offers a way for us to find redemption amongst such senselessness, and a means to try and understand the motivations behind the darkest aspects of human behavior that we, as average individuals who don't have inclinations to commit violent crimes, cannot relate to. And what we can't understand, we fear. And what we fear, we find ways to justify it. Evil tends to fascinate us, as Stacy Nye, a professor of psychology and director of the Milwaukee Psychology Clinic, so perfectly states. And that's why there's a particular allure in playing armchair detective and trying to solve a violent crime from the safety of our homes. By immersing ourselves in the details of a real-life case without actually having to experience it ourselves, we gain a sense of control and understanding over something that is otherwise inexplicable and oftentimes terrifying. It's also one of those interactive forms of entertainment media calling for us to engage in the investigation from a controlled environment. It's kind of like horror films in that way, which allows us to immerse ourselves into fearful situations, but always with the knowledge that we can pull back into our own realities at any given time. On the topic of stories, I think it's important to know the way these content creators on digital platforms like YouTube, TikTok, or Spotify present true crime cases to their audiences. While there are undoubtedly some content creators who aspire to accurately portray the crimes and deliver victim-centric narratives, there are many out there who approach it in a questionable manner that fictionalizes these real stories and real people. In the attempt to attract viewers, some content creators deliberately exaggerate titles or thumbnail descriptions, which would subsequently make them an extra buck with every click. And the attention and money generated from their content come at the expense of the dignity and respect of these victims. It's not hard to find sensationalized titles when you look for them. They're everywhere, and they've become bafflingly popular. And the thumbnails usually feature the content creators themselves, usually white women, posing in an attractive way amongst elements of the cases around them. It almost seems very symbolic of the way the victims often take a backseat to their own stories and instead are almost tangential to the content creators. And the thumbnail is very indicative of how the storytelling usually goes. Some true crime narratives focus way more on the details of the crime itself than on the victims or the impact of the crime on the community. And this can create a distorted view of crime that glamorizes violence and criminal behavior. Another way in which true crime entertainment on YouTube historicizes its victims is by treating them as objects of curiosity rather than real people with complex lives and relationships. By focusing on the crime itself and the perpetrator and their motives, rather than the victim and their experiences, can lead to a one-dimensional portrayal of the victim, reducing them to being somewhat of a plot device in an unfortunate story, rather than a human who had undergone extreme trauma. Oftentimes, because these content creators are white women, it comes with a certain set of privileges, and the way they tell their stories can often ignore the context of the crime, such as potential socio and economic factors that may have contributed to the victim's vulnerability. Furthermore, true crime entertainment on YouTube may also perpetuate harmful stereotypes and biases about the victims, particularly those from marginalized communities. And to be able to tell someone's story when they might not be able to do so themselves is again another very privileged position to be in. Oftentimes, what happens is the way these narratives are being delivered contains a lot of personal bias and perpetuate harmful stereotypes about the victims, particularly those from marginalized communities. For example, victims who are members of the racial or ethnic minorities, members of the LGBTQ community, or those with mental health conditions may be portrayed in a way that reinforces negative stereotypes and, again, perpetuate harmful attitudes toward these groups. And this can lead to victim blaming. People often ask the question of, well, why did they get themselves into the situation in the first place, instead of what a horrible crime this is. This can further marginalize these communities and contribute to a culture of violence and discrimination. Through the use of reenactments, dramatizations, and other cinematic techniques, digital true crime often blurs the line between fact and fiction, presenting a distorted version of events that can be misleading and exploitative. In some cases, this type of content can be traumatic for victims and their families to almost re-experience. And these are the people who may feel as though their experiences have been reduced to mere entertainment. Furthermore, by emphasizing more salacious and sensational aspects of true crime stories, digital media has the potential to propagate detrimental stereotypes and foster a culture that prioritizes surface-level spectacle rather than meaningful substance. What happens often is that these content creators, to draw in views and to retain viewership, they will glorify and drag out violent portions of the crime and focus on what happened in those moments rather than seeking justice, pushing for more media coverage and advocacy, or, donating to the continued welfare of these victims and families. While true crime can be a very, very powerful tool for raising awareness and promoting justice, as I just mentioned, it is so important for creators and consumers alike to approach these stories with sensitivity and respect for those who have been personally affected by these crimes. And something else I really want to discuss that is so bizarre to me is the fact that many content creators out there pair their true crime content with a passive activity as a way to make it more palatable, like with mukbangs or makeup. Take Miss Bailey Sarian, for example, a true crime YouTuber with over 6.83 million subscribers who narrates her story with a side of makeup. Yes, because what's more interesting than watching a woman put on beautiful, sometimes extravagant makeup while detailing the most gruesome and traumatic experiences that someone else just had to go through? Don't get me wrong, she is extremely talented and I wish I could get makeup as good as hers. But something about pairing makeup, something so intrinsically aesthetic with something so horrific just doesn't sit right with me. Her series, Murder, Mystery, and Makeup, has generated over 450 million views cumulatively and has allowed her the freedom to pursue YouTube as a full-time occupation. I think in any case, I love it when women are able to take up spaces where they can explore their interests and become financially independent. But something I cannot get behind is that her goal is to make violent crimes against women and children more palatable for her viewers in order to make it less scary to listen to. And to that, I have to say, it's supposed to be scary. Violence and crime should not be palatable and should not cater to our comfort as viewers, because it wasn't comfortable for the victims who had to go through it. It should make us extremely uncomfortable. And the fact that digital content creators are pairing violence and another aesthetic, casual element to dilute its content is bizarre to me. Even as a true crime junkie in the past, that was something I could never get behind, because I think somewhere deep down, even though I enjoyed listening to true crime, I just couldn't excuse it being paired with something that's so casual. And Sarian isn't the only creator who tries to make her content more friendly. Let's take a look at popular true crime podcaster Stephanie Sue, who has 2.9 million subscribers as of now and over 6.6 million views across all videos on YouTube. And while it's hard to find out how many listens she has on her podcast, Rotten Mango, her success is clear as it continuously ranks at the top among other true crime podcasts. What I do know, however, is that 68.9 thousand listeners have ranked it a 4.9 out of 5 stars on average. Now, I was personally introduced to Stephanie Sue in high school when my friends and I were first discovering true crime as a genre. And I remember how everyone was saying something along the lines of how much they just loved watching her mukbangs and listening to her murder stories. And for those who don't know, a mukbang is an audio-visual video that just features someone eating. Simple as that. It usually features an attractive young female eating a very large amount of food. And so Stephanie pairs her mukbangs with true crime content. So aside from all the criticism that Stephanie Sue has received about eating habits and promoting/triggering eating disorders, she's also been called out for clickbait titles that attract viewers or listeners, as well as sensationalizing this content purely for entertainment purposes. Now, back to when I was really big on true crime, one of the episodes I listened to is titled The Coca-Cola Torture Murder, which follows the violent torture, rape, and abuse of a 15-year-old girl named Sylvia Likens. And if you're anywhere near the true crime world, you'll know that this case is a popular one, and chances are many have heard of this horrific case. So where does Coca-Cola come into this, you may ask, especially if you do know this case? And the issue is that it doesn't really. Not enough to justify the branding. The title Coca-Cola Torture undoubtedly draws in listeners, as it's not odd to wonder what this brand had to do with the murder of this minor. But a Coca-Cola bottle was only tangentially involved in this entire ordeal. But Sue latched onto this one aspect and branded Sylvia Likens with it, ensuring that their viewers get an extremely sensationalized image of her murder that tempts higher viewership. And when I listened to this episode, even though it was pretty early on in my true crime phase, I still couldn't help but feel a bit weirded out by the fact that Sylvia's entire legacy was being reduced to a brand that had nothing to do with her eventual murder. Her legacy was ultimately being tied to a weapon that was used to beat her to death, instead of all the wonderful things that she was when she was alive. In a later episode, Stephanie Sue even goes on to comment about how she didn't know why she titled this episode The Coca-Cola Torture Murder, but she made this comment in a very flippant and nonchalant kind of manner, not even recognizing the problematic implications of doing so. And this is just one of the many, many titles that Stephanie Sue uses to sensationalize her videos and stories and draw in more viewers. And I'm not done with Stephanie Sue quite yet. In her Rotten Mango podcast description, Stephanie Sue describes it as being rotten but still a little sweet, promising not to leave out any goriness or darkest details that are often censored on other streaming platforms like YouTube. She even welcomes her listeners by stating, "Don't worry, it all comes with a seasoning of comedy/sweetness." And personally, I don't believe that true crime and comedy should ever intersect. There's nothing sweet or funny about crime. And having listened to many of her podcast episodes before, I can say for sure that Sue has a very lighthearted and comical storytelling method but she makes sure that her voice becomes very soft and shaky when discussing something exceptionally horrendous. But due to the way she sells her brand on these platforms, this all seems a little bit performative to me. Let's move on to Bella Fiore, a lifestyle YouTuber who has grown an audience from her vlogs and beauty videos. She eventually turned her focus to more of a true crime approach after having established a following through these lifestyle vlogs, and has been heavily criticized for her presentation. I've personally watched many of her videos, and I have to agree. She has adopted a sort of peppy and relatable big sister personality in her true crime Mystery Monday series, where she usually dons funky earrings in her videos. Some of these come in very unique shapes, like dismembered hands or bloody knives, which I have to say comes across as extremely insensitive and ignorant to the material that she is delivering. Not to mention, Bella has stated very, very clearly in many of her videos that one of her biggest motivations behind starting Mystery Mondays is that she used to be a criminology major. And the reason why she became a criminology major is that she was very interested in the way minds work. And one would think that having gone through such intensive and academic schooling on the topic, that she would be a little more mindful and sympathetic about the way she delivers these cases. Another true crime YouTuber and podcaster a little bit newer to the scene is called Haley Elizabeth. And she has been called out for mispronouncing names and places, as well as failing to deliver the case with the sensitivity or nuance needed. Her storytelling method often comes off as a bit distant and like gossip rather than an investigative coverage, and she ends most of her videos by describing her makeup and fashion choices for the day. Not to mention that Bella and Haley have both been called out for using Wikipedia as their main source of research, even reading off the page word for word. And it doesn't take an academic to understand that Wikipedia is not the most reliable source, as it allows users to edit its content. And we can be here for days just naming creators and criticizing their work, but I think you get the idea for now. But before we move on, I just want to point out the sheer number of true crime content creators who pair their storytelling with a secondary element, if you will. Usually it's makeup or food, and essentially, it appears as if content creators are sacrificing ethics to appeal to the masses. But should they be appealing to the masses? Should murder, salacity, violence, and gore appeal to everyone's palates? I argue that someone else's trauma should not be made palatable for public consumption. This secondary element further diminishes the victim's stories and instead glorifies the violence in these crimes. It fictionalizes these stories as if they were mere gossip to be shared over lunch or as we get ready. Additionally, as creators aestheticize themselves in these videos, it aestheticizes the victims and horrific crimes. But we do have to keep in mind the fact that the success of such videos isn't reliant on the secondary element. It's the true crime that really keeps viewers watching. Bailey Sarian, Stephanie Sue, Haley Elizabeth, Bella Fiore, and many, many more creators don't offer tutorials in their videos. They're not telling us how to get their smoky eye or flattering contour. It's safe to assume that we'll still be getting the same value from these videos, even if these secondary elements were omitted. So what is it about these secondary elements that make people keep coming back for more? Let me introduce to you the concept of Schadenfreude. Excuse my pronunciation. It is a German word, and according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it means the joy over some harm or misfortune suffered by another. And you might be thinking, wait, that's horrendous. Why would I ever delight in someone else's suffering? It's not that simple. Let me explain. It's not so much as sadistically cackling at violence, but rather more of a sense of relief, if that makes sense. According to an article written by Amber Spence in The Boar, it essentially boils down to the reasoning of, if this bad thing had to have happened, at least it didn't happen to me. It points to a darker and more hedonistic side of the human being, a side that we suppress with some sort of evolutionary urge, and perhaps also the social expectation of behavior. For most of us, we don't commit or identify with murder because we know it's socially and evolutionarily wrong. But that doesn't mean that there's still a part of us that's curious about what would happen if this dark side were to not be suppressed. And that also doesn't mean there aren't people out there who don't want to suppress this darker side. Hence, the existence of serial killers and the sort. I think that this is where we get our fascination with criminals. If we can't discover our darkest potentials ourselves as the risk of consequences is too high, listening to stories about criminals is our next best resource. With this reasoning, it makes sense as to why people are more prone to produce and consume the material that seems to overly emphasize gore rather than focusing on victim-centric storytelling. So it's not that humans don't care about the victims affected, but it's our schadenfreude, or morbid interest in knowing that even though the scariest things happen in the world, it didn't happen to us. And it's also the pleasure of knowing that we aren't the ones who are sick and twisted enough to commit such a heinous crime. And we're still here with our pretty makeup palettes in hand. No wonder we gravitate towards such stories. We are trying to make sense of the chaotic events that are almost unfathomable to our mind, while simultaneously feeling rewarded with the gratification that we aren't the ones entangled in these horrific crimes. I kind of want to go back to an earlier point I made about the aestheticization of true crime through the methods of storytelling employed by creators. As I mentioned, creators applying makeup and designing mysterious and spooky thumbnails effectively aestheticize these stories as if they were something to admire rather than something to be horrified by. This, alongside the sensationalization of true crime stories, directly contribute to the way crimes are glorified and criminals are romanticized. Let me introduce you to the term hybristophilia. According to the American Psychological Association, this is the sexual interest in and attraction to those who commit crimes. In some cases, this may be directed toward people in prison for various types of criminal activities. Now, if you're flabbergasted at the fact that such a term even exists, I'm here to share your incredulity. Now, I don't want to focus too much on the psychological background of how or why one may experience hybristophilia. There are links in my works cited that you may want to check out in the case that you do. But I will talk about how true crime entertainment can contribute to creating these fantasies around violence and crime. Let's take Ted Bundy, for example. He is a notorious serial killer, known for earning the trust of many of his victims due to his charming demeanor and conventionally attractive physical features. He ended up confessing to murdering over 30 women, but it's suspected to be even higher than that. However, it's also true that while incarcerated, he had a fan base of hundreds of women, even getting married to his girlfriend during his sentence. And he isn't the only one. Jeffrey Dahmer, Richard Ramirez, the Zodiac Killer, Edward Gein, and even school shooters, all notorious for violent crimes with a dedicated fan base, most of whom are women. There are occasional men scattered in there, but male fans usually are less there for the romance, but they do admire what this killer has done. I want to bring up a relatively recent case. Cameron Herron, a 21-year-old who was just sentenced to life when street racing as an 18-year-old back in 2020 and killing a mother and her toddler. His case blew up on TikTok because he was apparently deemed as attractive and mysterious because he had a black mask on in his trial. This caused many to rationalize this appalling and rash behavior to being just young and attractive, many even calling for his release. You see, the issue with true crime is that they feed into hybristophilic tendencies. These sensationalized and sometimes even romanticized storytelling methods further strengthens the idea that, yes, criminals are simply misunderstood and deserve love just like anyone else. But just imagine your child, your parent, your loved one suffered an unimaginable crime, and then people begin to crush on the perpetrator, even advocating for their release? Why do they get to live, to marry, to feel love when the victims were forcefully stripped of all of that? Louis Schlesinger, a professor of forensic psychology, marvels at, quote, criminals can make the perfect boyfriend in a way. These women know where their boyfriend is at all times, and they only have to share positive encounters with him, because criminals are usually on their best behaviors during visiting day. Weirdly, it's a controllable and safe relationship option, and these warped portrayals of criminals that glorify the criminal's mind is a breeding ground for select women seeking some sort of sexual intrigue and high. It's not normal or even morally correct, I would argue, to fantasize about serial killers or violent criminals, and psychologists have yet to study this phenomenon of hybristophilia, but it is believed that it stems from a history of abuse and neglect, especially from a parent or a partner. It's also important to note that many serial killers and psychopaths get off on fame using crime as their way to obtain such attention. And so, when stories glorify crimes instead of victims' stories, again feeds into their self-indulgent nature. It's most likely what they're looking for, and they would risk imprisonment just to get it. But the love of serial killers and violence isn't the only potential psychological impact of true crime. What about the people against whom these crimes happen? What about the victims and their families and their communities even? Side note, my FBI agent is definitely giving me the side eye after seeing searches like Ted Bundy fan base in my history. Oftentimes, our intrigue in true crime comes at the cost of a human life. If you think about it, in order for us to receive true crime entertainment, someone else has to suffer. In most cases, it's more than one person. It's a community that has to suffer in order for us to get our daily fill of crime. We have to think about the effects of such romanticization of criminals on the actual victims and families who are involved. As consumers, we often subconsciously think about how these true crime entertainment videos can satisfy our cravings. By picking and choosing, as consumers, which videos are most valuable or interesting enough for us to pay attention to, it turns someone else's suffering as capital for these creators. And that's why creators often use bizarre titles and focus on gory details, as that is what draws us in, as I discussed earlier. But who are we to choose whose life is more important? Who are we to judge who deserves attention and thus justice? Have victims and their families not suffered enough? By immortalizing victims through the retelling of their stories in a sensationalized manner, we tie their legacy to the worst moments of their lives. For victims and their families, it's like we are forcing them to continually relive this trauma again and again. Families have come out to plead with creators to stop larger production companies to no avail. And for casual content creators, their level of accountability is even lower. I implore you as a content creator to reflect on your motivations for capitalizing on trauma and to continuously be conscientious of the way your storytelling may appear to audiences. And while we're talking about mental health, let's also talk about the research done to investigate the ways consuming true crime can impact our own mental well-being. Remember Bailey Sarian? In an interview with E! News, she said how she avoids true crime content when she doesn't need to be at work, acknowledging the very real impacts of true crime material on mental health. Dr. Chinova Childs from the Cleveland Clinic states that, quote, shows that focus on murder and rape can really take you to a bad place. They can help you become more vigilant and aware, but you don't want to become overly reactive to the point where you're not leaving your house and you're not socializing and you're not functioning. Personally, when I was at my true crime peak, so to speak, I was primarily listening to it at night while everyone else was asleep, and kind of in the background as I did my bullet journaling. And the paranoia I began to feel after a couple of weeks of just nonstop binging is definitely real. I can attest to that as a casual consumer. I began to feel extremely suspicious of everyone around me, even feeling extremely unsafe in situations that it wasn't really called for. This coupled with the COVID-19 ramifications, I was just not having a good time in public. And Dr. Childs agrees that true crime can cause paranoia and anxiety in people, especially women, who are generally more prone to anxiety disorders. And like I mentioned earlier, women are the primary demographic for true crime. It's almost like when an older sibling tells you a scary story when you were a naive 4-year-old who genuinely believed that there was a monster in your closet. You become scared and paranoid, and you need your mother's comfort, telling you that monsters aren't real, with a side of admonishment for your older sibling. But what do we do in the case where the monsters are in fact real? And they do indeed roam in the closet, that is, the earth. There's nothing fiction about monsters in the adult world. According to Docwitty, true crime content creators cherry pick the most bizarre stories, which proliferates in, quote, unnecessary sense of doom, end quote. They also state that, quote, chronic exposure to such stresses, possibly by overexposure to crime shows, can lead to mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. Listening to terrifying stories before bedtime can cause nightmares and result in sleep deprivation issues, end quote. And I want to also argue that it can lead to desensitization of violence, and can cause you to begin even enjoying depictions of violence, which I don't think I need to say is extremely concerning. We will then begin craving increasingly more violent depictions the more this happens, and the cycle only continues. People are genuinely getting to the point where stories of rape and torture don't even faze them anymore. Dr. John Bradford, a retired professor from the University of Ottawa, stated in an article published by CBC that, quote, what people do not realize is the power of video to affect certain people, to cause vicarious trauma or full-blown PTSD, end quote. He also said, quote, we cannot minimize the powerful effect of these types of videos, end quote. Yes, you heard that right. We can in fact traumatize ourselves through watching these videos, and it can thus have a long-lasting and life-changing alteration in our brain chemistry. This is only some of the effects of a long, long list, and I argue that even one of these impacts is enough to reconsider the way we mindfully consume and produce this type of media. One final thought on this topic, I want to impress the issue that arises with taking care of one's mental health as consumers. It almost seems a bit problematic to me. We get to sit back and perform self-care rituals to essentially soothe or cleanse our minds from the violence we just listened to, but victims don't have that liberty or that luxury. But despite everything I just discussed, there are some incredibly positive impacts that the digital true crime community has contributed to criminal justice and the general welfare of the broader community. It would be unjust for me to omit this information, pun intended. By far, one of the biggest pros of this genre is the widespread sharing of information on a case. Of course, with this comes with a concern of widespread misinformation, but let's continue with the pros, shall we? One of the first true crime podcasts, a grandfather if you will, called Serial, indeed did help the release of an innocent man accused of murder after 23 years. The Your Own Backyard podcast helped police make an arrest in the infamous case of the disappearance of Kristen Smart. And there are countless other instances of podcasts either reopening cases or straight up helping solve these cases, such as Teacher's Pet, Up and Vanished, Hell and Gone. That's not all. It can also bring about policy change. In the case of Amber Hagerman, a 9-year-old who was kidnapped and later found deceased, the community was able to rally around her parents and eventually successfully contributed to implementing the Amber Alert system. Although Amber's murderer is unfortunately still unfound to this day, she has inadvertently helped bring home over 1,000 children in North America since its conception in 1996. We can only hope that her killer is found soon. Oftentimes, in light of a collective outcry from the community spurred on by true crime media, more of such systems and policies are implemented to ensure that future individuals and children are protected. True crime content creators have the capacity to rally an entire digital community, transcending physical boundaries and casting more awareness, especially on smaller cases that the mass media don't deem as being important enough to broadcast. Though, yes, potential misinformation can arise, the public pressure on law enforcement to solve these cases with haste and thoroughness has massive benefits on potentially less covered cases. The true crime community is also extremely vocal about proper policing procedures when addressing violent crime, victims gathering evidence, and crime scene care. They are able to hold police and lawyers accountable for their own education and to eventually getting justice. Additionally, true crime cases are currently being used in law enforcement and legal classrooms, allowing current students to become well-trained when dealing with similar cases in the future. Some other pros can be encouraging witnesses to speak up even after decades of silence, reopening cold cases, using a collective mind to determine potentially missed leads. It also gives people a better understanding of the criminal justice system. Another pro could be that it encourages us to be more vigilant and take safety precautions, empathize with victims of the crime, as well as encourage donations that help victims and families. Now, remember how I mentioned earlier that women make up most of true crime consumers? This makes sense, as women are usually the victims of violent crimes that get turned into true crime content. According to Stacey Nye, women use this content to educate themselves to assess potentially dangerous situations, be able to understand warning signs of manipulation or abuse, and also resources and how to reach out for help should something ever happen to them. Thus, even though it links back to a fear of being victimized as women in a male-dominated society, being more aware of our surroundings as women is definitely an asset. Although, in an ideal world, I would argue that people just don't victimize women in the first place, but I guess this is the best way to protect some potential victims at this current time. It can overall just allow individuals to protect themselves, while at the same time advocate for members affected by violent crime. Now, I hope that my stance here is clear. True crime isn't inherently evil, but the content that it deals with is. And so with this in mind, it's important to ensure that this information and these stories are told with sensitivity. Only then can true crime be a productive genre. And you're probably asking, how do we do this? I'm going to bring up two of my favorite true crime content creators, Danielle Hallen and Kendall Ray. Although true crime content creation is questionable in itself, these two creators, I feel, do it justice as much as they are able to. Both Danielle Hallen and Kendall Ray provide well-researched content, ensuring to draw in viewers, but at the same time, deliver a story that is victim-centric. Both women ensure to donate at least a portion of their profits to organizations that help support victims and families, such as Thorn, a charity that is dedicated to ending child trafficking. Both women don't have a second element like makeup or mukbang. They tell things as is, a real and unembellished recount of trauma that needs to be addressed. Danielle and Kendall also encourage their viewers to also support their organizations and become active participants in the true crime community. And can I just say, watching their videos is so much different than watching someone else who is just there for the capital. It is so evident that Danielle and Kendall really care about these victims. They even invite victims' families onto the channel to really explain their side of the story. Although at first glance, Danielle and Kendall seem to market their videos in the same sensationalized way as anyone else does, but I argue that their genuine content really makes up for it. After all, in this current climate of true crime content, they are simply drawing in much needed attention to their victims' stories in a way they know that appeals to viewers. Perhaps this is just my long-winded way of saying that there's a difference between a true crime junkie and a straight-up murder and violence junkie. True crime creators really need to help delineate this difference a little bit more by providing nuanced and accurate information. True crime and entertainment is inherently oxymoronic. Nothing should be entertaining about true crime. And so it's hard to argue that any participation in consumption can be ethical in itself. But because it's arguably in our nature to discover such darkness, we have to just be mindful that we are using this information productively and ensure that we show action beyond passively watching or just listening along. Alright, as you can see, there are many cons and also many pros. Right now, I think I side more with the cons just because of the current climate of true crime is not to the point where it is sensitive enough for me to justify its existence. I hope that I was able to provide you with a nuanced investigation into the true crime entertainment world. Overall though, the last thing I want to do is dictate how you prefer to spend your free time, but I do hope that I can encourage us all to be more conscious digital consumers, especially when the content is so sensitive and can cause massive and long-lasting psychological impacts on victims, but as well as us as consumers. This is not a unique concern, as many psychologists, law enforcement workers, and even true crime content creators and consumers themselves are coming forward to critique the current treatment of this genre. And so with my voice also being added to the collective, I am encouraged to see the trajectory of this genre hurtling toward positive and active change. Thank you.